I take the opportunity because Charlene's a close colleague, but also a dear friend, so it's a great pleasure to introduce you here at the University of Sydney. So Charlene's an Associate Professor at the National Institute of Education and Manual Technological University in Singapore, and is also the co-director of the Asian Dramaturgs Network. Charlene's a Malaysian theatre educator, a researcher, and a dramaturg, and her work really focuses on difference, interdisciplinarity, play-based pedagogy, and thought leadership in urban multicultural contexts. And she's currently engaged in what I believe to be a really ambitious but timely kind of piece of work where she's using her experiences as a dramaturg and theatre practitioner and an artist and a scholar to wonder about what it means for us to be present and what it means for us to build sort of critical connections to people and places. And her presentation today is titled Listening as Critical Sensing, Dramaturg to Engage with Various Appearances.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here. I'm really grateful to the University of Sydney for this opportunity to meet you and to share some of these ideas that, as Kelly said, I've recently begun to work with or articulate in this way. So very grateful to Kelly for hosting me, to Anna and Glenn for arranging this. I just must say that when I wrote the synopsis some weeks back, I thought it might need to be a longer session, so I said the possibility of a workshop. But instead, I'll speak for about 30 minutes, and then hopefully we can have discussion, dialogue. And along the way, I will offer some questions as provocations for us to consider. And we can play with these or other questions that you may have along the way. I invite you to listen in ways that work for you. I don't have a slide presentation. You can close your eyes, you can move around, you can lie down, you can have a drink, you can go get some more food in between, whatever works best for you. It's Friday afternoon. The weekend really should begin. My work as a theatre practitioner and educator in Malaysia and Singapore has been a meandering and a circuitous one. I've wandered in and out of varied kinds of thinking and doing in relation to performance making since I was a teenager. In the 1970s, I was part of a national children's theatre workshop in Kuala Lumpur for a few years. And then I worked with Five Arts Centre, an interdisciplinary performing arts collective in the 1990s. And then I moved to Singapore in 2001 to teach theatre formally, having learnt it only informally, in a university, and then collaborate with different people there. And I'd say these are the key milestones in an ongoing journey. I've been fortunate to have worked with a range of experimental and interdisciplinary artists. They were also often educators. It was necessary to make a living. But I realize in retrospect, it was part of how they enlarged their practice as artists. These were individuals who were co-creating, thinking, and doing spaces with students as well as with fellow artists. It was highly collaborative. Performance making was also often a learning process, given that many in the theatre landscape were not formally trained. But they were wanting to be critically exacting and aesthetically innovative. Their social, cultural, and political convictions about the relationship between art and everyday life called for this. Also, having lived most of my life in two similar but different, officially multicultural cities, Kuala Lumpur and Singapore, I've been insatiably curious about the dynamics of difference, what it takes to engage in deep dialogue across boundaries that are constantly shifting. And yet, these boundaries also derive forceful presence from historical processes of staking out space and place in relation to culture, nationhood, identity, memory, etc. The dialogue of boundaries is not just external, but internal. So let me read from a poem I wrote in the 90s that speaks to this perhaps more clearly. It's called So Much of Me. So much of me is English, my dreaded colonial heritage. From Enid Blyton to Beatrix Potter, my ears lie distant in Yorkshire. So much of me lives Anglo, my dreaded white inheritance. From Laura Ashley to Marks and Spencer, my istanas, palaces, all built in Windsor. So much of me misplaced. Really, I'm Malaysian. Ceylonese, Tamil, Anglophile, all. Mingled by history, not choice. So much of me misfit. My outfits all merge and combine, from kurongs of cashmere to kain batik ball gowns. My palate eats roast beef with rice. So much of me mixed up. Sejarah, Malay word for history, that spans a globe, from Perth to Papua, Toronto to Trent. My saudaras, relatives, by boat and by flight. So much of me is muddled. Malaysian, Ceylonese, unsure. My anglicized fancies in tepatan, or local dreams, make mush in so much of me. So now, as I embark on this sabbatical journey, I find myself wanting to attend to the emergent complexities that inform what it takes to turn up for each other. To engage in processes of inquiry, artistically and pedagogically, in relation to what it takes to be present, what it means to consider culture, context, and conviction as aspects of making choices that enhance our capacity to nurture relationships with people, material, things, beings, space, time. Especially when there are many forces that reduce interaction and connection to the transactional, the efficient, the impactful, meetings to get something rather than build something. How then do we think and feel through arts-led engagements that are open, quiet, and slow? If this demands a willingness to take on fragility, care, and courage in a complex process, how do we forge thinking and doing in the arts that is conducive for this? What makes the arts a vital force for sensuous and critical living? As a dramaturg for projects that are largely devised, collaborative, and interdisciplinary, my work has entailed critical listening, being attentive to what is emerging in the process. Not unlike my work as an educator, I work through dialogue rather than monologue, attending to what emerges in the process of knowledge shared and explored rather than simply the imparting of data or information. So I've been led to look closely at the work of listening, how it's related to an active presence that allows for a to and a fro, or a flow of energy, which opens up space for multiple options and perspectives, willing to cultivate quiet in order to be receptive, and seeks to slow down so we don't have to hear in a hurry. This quality of listening is, in my view, key to generating or encouraging precarious appearances, a placeholder idea which I'm exploring. But first, a story. What if I have no friends? In an undergraduate module that I teach, titled Directing in Dramaturgy, a student asked a question that has stayed with me, largely because I responded very poorly and it gnawed at me. The module is part of a minor study that we do for the university, or a second major for students who are interested in theatre. So students who register for this module have to develop a directing project, 8 to 10 minutes, using excerpts from one of the 2 plays that we've explored together, which means they have to enlist at least one person who will work with them as an actor, preferably 2 or 3. They're not given the option to direct themselves. They can volunteer for each other or approach those who are willing to allocate that time and energy to the project, including anyone who's never done theatre, because only a tiny percentage of their peers at university would have done some theatre at school. It can be a challenge. Drama is not part of the official curriculum in the Singapore context. So this responsibility to helm and steer an arts-based project is critical to their learning. They're not just there to write an assignment that will secure a good grade, but learn how to work with people who volunteer their efforts and their creativity to attend rehearsal, at least 3 to 5. To then sit with them and discuss ideas and make choices that allow a young learner to experiment with what comes up in the process. They're encouraged to work collaboratively, not simply mount a pre-planned set of strategies onto a bunch of passive bodies. So they're tasked to think dramaturgically about their directorial vision, as well as how to negotiate time, space, creative energy with the actors they've chosen and who've agreed to participate. It's not intended to be easy, and students approach friends they can trust usually, or who are curious about the process, keen to act. So when this question emerged in a discussion about scheduling and preparing to work with actors, it was potent. She asked, half seriously and half in jest, What if I have no friends? Initially, I laughed gently, as did her classmates, to diffuse the tension. She's bright, she's confident, she's a capable individual. She's someone with prior theatre experience. So I heard this as an expression of, what if I cannot find the right people to work with me and it affects my grade? Or what if the people I want to work with don't agree with me? I didn't take her question literally. So I responded with a kind of chuckle in my voice, half seriously, half in jest. Well, time to make some. And the discussion continued. But the question kept returning to me. And as I examined it further, I realized she was asking something critical about that demand being made, not just in the module, but in performance making, perhaps even in teaching and learning. What if people are not willing to work deeply and co-create with me as part of the learning? What if I can't get people interested to participate in deep play with me and then help execute my directorial vision? After all, the actors get no credits for their efforts and time. They're not being assessed. They're there to help a friend, which makes them an invaluable resource and sometimes difficult to find. My initial response was clearly insufficient. The question was an opening to examine the issue of human relationships in a directing project. We had discussed this earlier, but now, when thinking about the pragmatic dimensions of scheduling, there was anxiety building. The precarity of having to turn up for others in a way that's not often demanded. The entanglements of people, material, ideas, text, context, and selves that one has to develop in performance making. A process that requires embodied giving and receiving, not just text messaging and screen appearances. These are live appearances, if only to a small group of people. Live appearances that can be riddled with uncertainty, precarious. Because the learning, which involves different kinds of thinking and doing, often leads to making mistakes in the company of others who can see this and watch how one tries to recover. It's a process that calls for a willingness to be interdependent in a temporary ecosystem of creative action and enactment. The process demands live encounters that entail being together in a space over a period of time and thinking, feeling, working, playing and acting together. And then making up the rules and the roles as we go along, with some frames in place to begin with, generating dialogic interactions as the basis for some co-creative options, and then listening closely to each other and enjoying the pleasures of being heard. This is a process that requires friends in the deeper sense of the word, regardless of a status on Facebook. So listening repeatedly to the question as it rolled in my head, I recognized that when it was asked, I was preoccupied with the pragmatics of schedules and frameworks and note-taking processes. I was not just rather closed, but I was enacting a noisy listening, unable to hear what was being raised beneath the surface. I was wanting to ensure that certain bits of information were being conveyed, and this buzzing sound and this insistent pattern, important as it was, got in the way of my being able to listen deeply. It prompted me to consider carefully the importance of open, quiet, and slow listening to allow for precarious appearances to occur without them being a source of anxiety or discomfort. And so I wonder if you have a question that you once heard and responded to, rather in a closed, noisy, and rushed mood, that you later thought about and would have heard differently. I wonder if we're trained to be efficient listeners by being quick and pointed, when we need to become ecological listeners, borrowing from Timothy Morton, who are unperturbed by the entanglements, the uncanny, and the strangeness of what is unfamiliar and blurry on the edges. So open, quiet, and slow listening, is this a framework for dramaturgies of resonance? I'd say that listening, particularly in performance making and performance teaching, is a conscious action of one's body and being. Action that attends and responds to voice, movement, sound, words, images, actions, vibrations, sensations that are present. It's a complex engagement in what is unfolding, to apprehend persons, places, politics, and pedagogies with an intuitive and critical apprehension, This kind of listening aims to work with what is resonant, what creates a stirring feeling, one that perhaps stems from a disturbed terrain or what Anna Singh would call a blasted landscape. It requires openness, quiet, a slow momentum to deal with whatever is happening, no matter how discomforting, that can be seen or felt or sensed or heard in relation to one's own processes of hearing and being heard. So if I were to ask myself what is most crucial about the act of listening, it's about that quality that is open, quiet, and slow so that sound resonates. Because to receive the vibrations that are being articulated, elocuted, echolocated even, while one is closed, noisy, and rushed, is to receive only a very small fraction of what's being emitted. So to be open, quiet, and slow to the range of frequencies that are being generated in communication or interaction is to be ready to allow what is to be, and thus to be available. To allow for things to come through one's own sensibility, not to receive it all, or agree fully, or accept it all, but to be with it, with as much capacity to encounter what's being communicated, what's being vibrated, the energy being sent out. Being open, quiet, and slow is to turn the dial down on one's own clanging and wait for what comes. I know when my inner voices are agitated, they're loud, they're insistent, there's anger, irritation, rage, not conducive spaces for listening. They tend to be full of noise. They make it hard to really get anything. And they have their place, don't get me wrong, but it's not for deep listening. Anger, rage, irritation are energies needed for taking certain kinds of action, but they're rarely helpful in being receptive to the voices that surround. So how does one cultivate the openness and quiet? Slowly, in time, taking time, through time. Responses that need to come too quickly or loudly curtail the capacity to sense what is being said. Instead, slow listening remains unperturbed by the pressure to form an opinion quickly, letting time move more deliberately. It's not that there is no response, but that response is allowed to take its time, finding the moment where something might need to be said, slowing down, giving time to the work of listening, slowing down in relation to the kind of openness that is expansive rather than expectant. This encourages, I think, a gradual unfolding rather than being pushed into reacting. More like a lotus slowly opening rather than a balloon being popped. The listening is also about a space where it's all right not to be able to understand it all. It's all right to have many questions, doubts, and concerns. It's all right for the vagaries, the uncertainties, because there's space for alterity and the mix and the mess and the mush of multiplicity. So, what are the hearing aids we need to put on in order to open, quieten, and slow down the pace of listening, even as we make space for listening? Space in a rehearsal room, in a theater, in a workshop, in a classroom, where we want to nurture safe space, but is it available to a different pace? What are the earplugs we need to pull out so that we might be able to hear clearer through the clutter, noise, and speed around us, because we've cultivated more expansiveness? Hush and flow within us, how will it grow? As educators and performance makers, how are we implicated in creating more clutter, more clamor, and a more frantic pace in the kinds of tasks we set for ourselves and each other? What sounds of precarity are we drowning out because there's no energy left to build a different way of being together? Another story, Friends Matter. In a film titled The Boy with Striped Pajamas, which is available on Netflix, some of you know you've seen it, based on a novel of the same name by John Boyne, two 8-year-old boys, one a German who's the son of an SS officer, and one a Jew and a Holocaust prisoner, meet across barbed wire in Nazi Germany. Across the treacherous fence of a concentration camp intended to keep people apart, they forge a relationship. They become friends. They do checkers, they share food, They learn to relate to each other while the grown-ups perform their assigned roles of enmity. The boys have not fully absorbed their differences as life-threatening, though they become aware of the perils of inequity in the hardship they witness and endure differently. Eventually, through a sequence of empathic choices to help each other, they perish in a brutal twist of destiny. Spoiler alert. They burn together, accidentally. What becomes critical to the story is their battle with the odds to remain friends. They make demands on each other. They take risks to be together. Will you bring me some food? Will you forgive what I did to you? Will you help me find my father? These are tough requests that defy the rules and could lead to serious consequences. But they find ways to meet these demands and they improvise ways to be together. They sneak away to a hidden secret place where they can play, across the barbed wire, despite the knowledge they'll be punished if they're caught. These are appearances they make to satisfy a need for friendship and for play, to be with someone who will share moments that others do not understand. Deep play that entails being there for oneself and the other, to laugh, to care, despite the barriers set in place to prevent the encounter. As children, they learn through experience what they're told, what they hear. They learn that they must not be friends, but they resist that logic. They create a kinship that comes at tragic cost. When they finally join hands in search of a father, they are led, literally, into a fatal fire. So when they resist the prevailing logic and create this friendship against all odds, they make precarious appearances. Not because they are daredevils or they want to prove a point, but because they realize the value of being together, caring for and learning to understand each other despite the rules that say this is unhelpful, this is unnecessary, this is unlawful. When the boys first meet, they're unsure how to read each other. Their clothes, their location, their routines, their rules are all markedly different. But they want a friend, and that makes it possible to connect and relate. One boy is lonely and goes looking for a friend by sneaking out the garage window. The other escapes from the crowd in the camp to sit in a quiet corner, and that's where they meet. They're both confined for different reasons, but they're both open to alternative options. They both haven't given up on the idea of another possibility, and hence they continue to turn up for each other. Sometimes they just sit quietly. Sometimes they just sit and let time pass across the wire. Friends matter. And a few days ago, I watched the Australian film set in Tasmania, The Nightingale, in which a friendship is forged between an Irish woman, Claire, who goes in search of a colonial officer who murdered her husband and child after raping her, and Billy, an Aboriginal man who starts off as a guide but later becomes a comrade. They also gradually learn how to read and hear each other. They eventually find ways to work with their differences, not just to coexist, but to serve their inner voices. They navigate and improvise what it takes to do so, even as they suffer the consequences of believing in the cause they serve, and that could be read variously. Justice, connectedness, agency. They're both stories of fiction, based on a reality. Both end with more questions than solutions. Both propel me to consider what it takes to be friends, to listen, to embody and enact appearances that allow for deep, difficult relationships to occur. To listen to someone who's distant, different, difficult, not merely out of curiosity, but because one needs to be in a sustained, interdependent relationship with this person, this thing, this ideology, this culture, can be tedious and painstaking. Working through the responses that acknowledge another point of view is to make space for this to be heard, but with respect, with sensitivity. This is responsibility for those who seek to be inclusive, making conscious effort to incorporate this voice, this energy, this vibration into the dialogue and find a response that allows it to be there, and the response to acknowledge it for what it is, and then an encounter that is ongoing. So in performance making and performance teaching that's collaborative, dialogic, and interdisciplinary, it's a necessity to take on multiplicity, to work with the mix and the mush that emerges. Yet I wonder about the scope to listen more intricately and deeply, to work with the precarity, which Anna Singh identifies as, quote, a state of acknowledgement of our vulnerability to others, which she says requires the arts of noticing curiosity in order to think through it and survive it with agency. So not to get over the precarity, but to work with the precarity. Perhaps this is a way of working and coexisting that's already built into performance that strives to engage, connect, challenge, and inspire at deep levels in situated and sensuous ways. Yet the appetite for challenging work seems depleted. How can it be recharged? What does it discard in the process of settling for only the comfortable? What's the quality of listening as audiences, as performers, speakers, as educators, as students? What's the quality of listening action that demands review? Hannah Arendt writes about the space of appearance in her book, The Human Condition, where she examines the concept of labor, work, and action. And she frames this idea in relation to the polis. And the polis here is not the city-state, she says, in its physical location. It's the organization of people as it arises out of acting and speaking together. It is, as she says, that space where I appear to others as others appear to me, and where people exist not merely like other living or inanimate things, but to make their appearance explicitly. So it's a creation of action. It's highly fragile. It exists only when it's actualized. And it is a space of potentiality that disappears after it's been enacted, but reappears when people gather again together. So she says, wherever people gather together, it is potentially there, but only potentially, not necessarily, and not forever. I want to suggest that in making that appearance, a precarious appearance particularly, the work of acting and speaking together needs to be enhanced by listening together. Listening together for the precarity and with the precarious, openly, quietly, and slowly. So that questions like, what if I have no friends? Will you bring me some food? What if I do not want to be friends? Will you forgive me? What if I want to stop being friends? Will you help me look for my father? Can not only be heard, but also resonated with, and then responded to, ethically and aesthetically.
So has anyone else got thinking about their questions, or the question that Charlene asked? One thing sort of struck me, because of course, probably every academic in the room could ask your thing where it's just like so much is happening at the time, and then someone asks you a question and you have to give that, in retrospect, oh my God, you should have got that right. And I was just actually interested in the context for listening, because that just say there's so many things, external things, which work against.
I'm so sorry.
There's so many contexts that work against creating a quiet space for listening.
Yeah.
And so I think what you're asking is to try and create that space within the noise.
Yeah, I think that question of context it's really complex, isn't it? Because there's so many energies, forces at work to define how to make the context work efficiently, impactfully, productively. And those become very noisy, I think. And I'm not against those terms or being efficient or productive or impactful, but I refer to them as control mechanisms that I use for certain KPI outcomes more than real value in doing. And I guess one of the things about generating context that is conducive is being sensitive to all the dynamics of culture, society, politics, person that are present in the room. And realizing one never fully gets it. And working with the uncertainties is part of allowing that precarity, I think, to be present without it being a disruption that creates that panic and hence the reaction, right? To breathe a little. I mean, I want to kind of explore this a little bit further and link it to the inhale and the exhale. And now we're learning that we're breathing too fast. There's science to show this that indicates that we should, I mean, people who do yoga breathing know this already. Inhale, hold the breath a little bit longer before the exhale, because the carbon dioxide is actually very good for us. And, you know, we've been sold the idea that it's only oxygen we need. And yet what the body needs is a complex combination of the various things that are going on in the inhale, holding the breath, and exhale. And it's a bit like that. What's the momentum we've gotten used to, normalized, which is effectively destructive and counterproductive, you know, counter-efficient, counter-impactful in ways that are sustainable, I guess. Yeah. I'm still thinking through it.
It's likely, Charlene, I'm going to come out with a bunch of observations which are often or stupid or don't have any questions, so I'm just going to start at the best. I think one of the things that you have highlighted so beautifully is the link between precarity and kind of collaboration, I suppose. And I'm wondering to what extent you have thought about kind of the great collaborations in your career and your kind of personal and social life, and to what extent that precarity and is part of it, and listening is part of a collaborative relationship that happens too rarely because we're not open enough to it, and whether that's part of the thinking as well. Yeah, I don't even know if there's a question.
Yeah, no, thank you. I think I hear you. So let me talk about a project I'm working on now as a way to answer the question. I'm working with a dancer, choreographer, performance maker called Maren de Cruz from Five Arts Centre in Kuala Lumpur. And she, over the COVID period, started writing. She couldn't get into the studio and she couldn't make work with dancers. And she's been saying for a long time she's not a writer. But what has happened is that this work is now going to occur in a performance space early December. But it started off as Zoom readings and Zoom events because that was what was available. The work is about various things that she has experienced in recent years: grief, loss, being a cancer survivor, COVID, and a range of things that as a woman who turned 70 this year, engaging with her body, are very specific and particular in her cultural context. Maren's an artist who has broken a range of various rules in her performance career. We are also very, very good friends. And so I became dramaturg when she said one day, Charlene, I think you just have to be the dramaturg. Because it didn't start that way. It started as I was just listening as a friend to her and talking with her and saying, let's try this, and why don't we try this, and why don't we do that? So a friend of mine came up in his practice with this word friend-turg instead of dramaturg, because he said, you know, actually that's what we do. It's not about so much the structures and the styles and a certain kind of conventional dramaturgy, which is about the making of a good play, let's say. But it is about this complex way in which the aesthetics, the ethics, and the personal synergies and chemistries are entangled. And so the collaborative process is one that I think is riddled with all kinds of precarity. How do we navigate the friendship and the artistic relationship and the fact that we're trying to look after so many aspects of our own well-being and our well-being together. And it became for me a way of realizing that to go into the deep questions that this project demands is also about making spaces where there is distance. And we kind of say, okay, let's have a meeting about this project. And I'm going to ask you a few questions as dramaturg, and I'd like you to respond as performer. And then we can have other conversations which are just nonsense conversations as well. But sometimes it's creating that accordion space of proximity and distance so that the precarity can allow for both, right? The anxiety of an artist, what are people going to think of my work, to the anxiety of a person and a friend who's like, what will people think of me when I read this part about how I have to, deal with constipation? Yeah. So it just is willing to, I think, be open and quiet and very slow. This project's taken about 2 years to evolve. Very, very, very slow. And so these terms then mean something different compared to when, okay, we've got 6 months to make a work, and then. I hope that sort of answers the question.
Any question here?
Thank you for that wonderful talk, Charlene. A couple of things I was struck with and wanted to ask you about. The first one was when you said the liveness of an appearance is what makes it precarious, the encounter. And I was also thinking then, that deep listening that you suggest, what is the space in that listening for silence as part of listening to precarity and the precarious, for the things that will never be said, never be articulated?
I think there's a lot of space for silence, and sometimes the silence is in the unknowing. And so sometimes it's an audible silence, meaning allowing for the fact that I don't really get this. I think we have to live with this uncertainty. We have to just stay with this a bit longer rather than finding articulation, right? Dramaturgs have this responsibility. We walk into the rehearsal room and immediately people are thinking, what's she gonna say after rehearsal? What's she writing in her notebook? So one of my things as a dramaturg is, where do I sit and what do I say? And so sometimes really just saying to the people that I'm working with, I don't know if I have anything to say at the moment. I need some time, or maybe this just needs to carry on a bit longer without anybody saying anything, is part of that silence. So apart from the actual silence, sometimes it's really a kind of conscious space making that says, let's just go with this a little bit longer. And sometimes I think that's also about allowing for things to come back again, right? Like, so there's a long period. So the artist may begin with lots of aspirations. I want the project to be this and this and this. And then just letting it be. And then 3 months down the line going, yeah, but what about this? So let it be silent for a while, but then let it echo later. Let it come back later, and let it reverb and resonate in that way. So I think it operates variously, not just as a literal silence, but as a conscious kind of, okay, let's just open it up and see what happens. Yeah.
Barbara?
Yeah, I keep returning to that original response of the person in the past saying, well, if I have friends, and then your own sort of exploration of friendship and listening, and thinking, well, it sounded to me also like the student wasn't listening very well. Because to me, that question, what if I have no friends, suggests that only friends can ask one another to be good collaborators. You know, the way you frame the assignment, to me, it's not just about friends. It's about allies or putting yourself out in order to get something back. And we can all think of examples of working with other people who you would not think of as friends.
Yeah.
And vice versa, friends who would never want to work with.
Yeah.
And so I don't know if it's about how you define friendship in that context.
Yeah.
Or that, you know, part of the student experience, presuming they were young and somehow have got disconnected from the cohort, there wasn't this wide enough understanding on their part in the listening to say, okay, it's not friends that I'm thinking about, it's something else. It's me giving something and forming an alliance or a collaboration, or however you want to. Yeah, so that's.
Yeah, I mean, I think I use the word friends, you know, as a placeholder rather than something that has very specific boundaries as to what counts as a friend, ally, collaborator, co-worker, colleague, you know, the whole gamut of possibilities comes into it. Peer. How was she listening? I think there was a lot of anxiety in the listening. And I think it is because the demands being made of another person exceeds the usual project work that occurs where people work together, they share a grade, etc., etc. Here, the ones who come in as actors don't get assessed. And so there's an anxiety about, well, might they mess it up for me is one concern, right? So therefore, if I don't have friends who are going to support me in more ways than just fulfilling what I need as a director, but support me in a range of other ways as well, then what happened? And so I think she heard the demands of the task actually quite deeply. As well as I think the demand is that as a student of the module directing in dramaturgy, too much to do in 30 weeks. I mean, but it's minor studies. That's a different story. The thought leadership that's being required of them is much more than they're being asked to do elsewhere most of the time, because they have to be vulnerable in order to fulfill the task. It's not that their confidence works against them, but they have to be with others, their peers, who are judging them and asking questions of them as they rightly should be, in ways that I think are valuable for their understanding of performance making, but which challenge, particularly in a Singapore context, which is highly competitive, it's highly results-oriented, it's highly individually driven, to now recognize an interdependence that's really very fragile, right? So they do ask, what if someone falls ill on the day? What if someone can't attend rehearsals? You know, what if I have to change actors last minute? Can I substitute for an actor who just suddenly decides not to turn up for rehearsal? All those things are very real. Of course they can. But they suddenly have to think about the fact that it's not just my health and well-being that matters. I have to look after my actors. I have to try and ensure they eat and sleep well. I'm trying to ensure my students eat and sleep well. They have to, so these are the dynamics that are not usually something they have to be preoccupied with. And then they have to, so of course it's anxious. And so, yeah.
So it sounds like anxiety is often working against this slow listening.
It works again. I mean, it works against if we don't use it to think through what's happening. I think that's what I'm trying to understand about the precarity. It's not about saying, okay, don't be anxious. The moment you say that, the adrenaline goes up and whoa, telling me not to be nervous, I'll be nervous now. Tell me how. It's about saying, it's about really responding with an awareness that says, yeah, and then how? And it will change depending on the dynamic of the group, the student, and me. And what's happening with me at the time, which I can't predict. There are no templates. It's going to be different the next time around.
Yeah, I'm struck, and I think people in the room will expect me to say this, struck by the parallels in what you're talking about in the work of Heidegger. So in Heidegger, Martin Heidegger, the philosopher. Heidegger. So I know it's
really,
but it's he advocates what he calls the Gelassenheit, which is a reticence and a withdrawal, a pulling yourself out to allow what is there to show itself to you. And with that comes, I think, a certain precarity, because that's not how we think of what knowledge is. For us, generally, knowledge is leaping into and prying. So there's a different sort of, I think, an epistemology at stake there. And leading towards the question that I sort of coming out of this, we're locked in this regime of calculative reason, which is part of the noise that we're talking about, in which learning itself is transactional, which is, about an accumulation of facts.
Yeah.
Whereas Heidegger would sort of say, well, of course, that's not what knowledge is. Knowledge is a swaying in and out of veiling and unveiling. That's very close to what you're talking about. But the problem that we've got, and you said, there's a different story to pragmatics. We're responsible, people in this room are responsible for the maintenance of a system of pedagogy, which is all about a kind of calculative reason and calculation and transaction and outcomes and rubrics and criteria and a particular regime of temporality, which goes completely against everything that you're saying. No, so my really pragmatic question is, how can we make this happen when we get 3 hours a week with a group of children, group of people, I'm thinking of my children, with people who are halfway out the door before they come in the door, who are calculating what they need to know and making a billion trade-offs. Like, how do we actually, let alone getting to that 6 months, getting to that careful engendering of trust? I despair. I've come back to teaching full-time this semester, and I just despair. I don't know how I can foster this kind of being with people.
I don't have the answer.
No. But what do you do? The very idea that we ask students to ask their friends to volunteer to do something is so far beyond the ken of what happens in this place.
Yeah. Thank you. And I think the importance of a valve, even if you can't have a heart transplant, the importance of a stent, even if you can't have a heart transplant, is profound. And so every little bit makes a little bit of a difference, even if one just allows for a shift in little things. That's what I say to myself in response to your question. And in the first couple of weeks, some students really struggle with that because they don't believe this is a good thing to do, that, she should be clearer about what she wants and how she wants it. She can't really be, doing this to us, what's it going to do for us. And I think with each time, the question for me is, how are the students talking to each other? It's not just about me. So we also teach 3 hours, theory and practice integrated, 13 weeks, and what can happen. Now, I must say at the onset that it's not possible with big classes. If you've got 30, forget it. I can't. it's impossible for certain processes to occur with 30 people in the room and one person trying to do it. So other kinds of processes then have to take on. But for the kind of thing I'm talking about, it is, ideally 12 to 16 really, but then depends on what you've got to do and who you've got to do it with. But even with 30 people in a room, sometimes the 10 or 15 minutes in which alternative things can happen make a big difference, because then I believe it gets infectious and they want a little bit more. And then they're willing to negotiate what else can happen within that. So, recently I had to run some workshops, and there was one group that was like 26 people, and there was another group that was 16 people. And the person from the Ministry of Education in Singapore, which in your experience, she said, it really does make a big difference, doesn't it? Yeah, what's the difference you observed? Pretending I didn't know that it really made a difference. And kind of sometimes saying, okay, this is as much as I can do. And then within that, something else might happen. So it really is about that uncertainty and the vagary, being allowed to be present.
But we're not allowed to have classes at this.
But it's tough.
And,
It's Again, I'll respond with another project that's ongoing. It's a work that's being restaged after having its initial outing in 2019 for the Singapore Bicentennial Celebration, celebrating 200 years of Raffles' arrival, colonial officer in Singapore. So many theatre makers made work in response to this celebration of the bicentennial. And one of them is a work about the Orang Laut. Orang Laut are a particular indigenous group of people. Literally, it means people of the sea, who basically used to live on their boats all around the Riau archipelago, of which Singapore is one spot. And this group of people are called the Orang Selita, who are therefore reference to a particular river in Singapore, but they no longer live in Singapore, they now live in Malaysia. And their story is what this work called Air, which means water in Malay, is about. And these questions arise. How do we hear their stories? We're so urban, we're so locked into ways of thinking about belonging and inheritance and rights and nation, when really the stories that they are talking about range from, I need to get my kids to school, and if we move from here to there, because there's a question of land and various contestations of land, the place that we have to move to is constantly getting flooded. And we're trying to think about some poetic way of performing a song that they used to sing. But we don't really sing this anymore.
Yeah.
So there's this constant way in which, we're having to figure out what is our ethical responsibility in telling this story, because the people who are performing are not Orang Laut. And there's, a long journey for the Orang Laut to go through before they even get to that point where they want their voices to be heard in a way that's happening here right now. I mean, they've gone quite a long way, this group, by simply taking up a court case that has meant they have to be allocated a different piece of land because they have to move from where they are because someone wants to build basically high-rise condominium apartments facing the sea, as you do. But all the more the gap is so huge, and yet do we then say we can't tell this story? Or do we acknowledge the fractures in our understanding as we attempt, hopefully with some respect and dignity that is acceptable, to do some kind of story? so complex. And, you know, most of the time, the multicultural Singapore and Malaysia is about Malay, Chinese, Indian, other. And the indigenous person isn't even in the landscape. They're not even there as a consciousness. They don't exist. So it's very interesting for me to be here at this point in time. Very interesting for all the problems and for all the pain. Hence, I was directed to suggest politely by a friend to watch The Nightingale, for example. And then yesterday I watched the documentary on Guru, might have even heard of. And these things on Netflix are not available in Singapore. They're only available on Netflix here. But it's
Thank you. I really do hope we get a chance to hear more.
Well, it takes us to just after 5 o'clock, and as Charlene said, it's a slide into the weekend.
Yes.
So I think we should just join me in thanking Charlene.
Thank you.